The thing is that our film, it's about an actor in a documentary. So one of the things that's happening is that you're watching, a like cinema verite, or sometimes or direct cinema, whatever you want to say, watching observational footage of an actor who's in her real life. So you're seeing her be theatrical. You're seeing her sort of, pick certain words to tell stories, or behaving in certain ways that an actor would behave, and a civilian would not behave. But to me that was very interesting. But one of the most interesting things about it is just what that brings up about documentary filmmaking in general. Because to me, everyone's performing. I'm performing now. We're all performing how we're doing our things. It's social performance. It's a kind of old idea about how to establish character and who you are as a person, is these social performances that we all play, gender performances, race performances, all kinds of things. And so that brings up a lot. What we wanted to do, part of the formal ideas in the movie, that a lot more happens in the movie that's beyond the formal stuff. But part of the formal ideas are that you see these performances, and then they start layering, and you start thinking about construction of storytelling. And to me, that the idea that you can capture an objective truth with documentary should absolutely be dead. It's impossible. It's dead. And so, well, what are we left with when we say that that's impossible? Or what does it mean when you say you can't be objective? Does it mean that there's no such thing as truth? I think that's worse. That's way worse if there's no truth in the world. So maybe truth is sort of when you see the layers, and that's factual truth is this happens, this happens, this happens. That's the goal of journalism. Basically speaking, that's a little bit simplistic, but you know what I mean. And an emotional truth is we have to edit, we have to construct, we have to use these layered performances to find something else, and that something else is sort of what an art experience should be, which is that you're moved to think about things differently, or you're moved to be questioned, and sometimes they're insolvable things. Sometimes you're watching and you're like, I don't really know how I feel now. And a lot of times documentaries are sort of judged like, if I don't know how I feel, it must not be telling me the truth, which is complete bullshit, obviously. Like if you don't know how you're feeling, and you think about it 5 minutes, and you think about it differently in an hour, that's a good art experience from my end. So
the way in which I would come back to the edit room and look at what I was filming with my subject, who's in that short scene, and there were some times when I believed his performance emotionally, and sometimes when I didn't. And it was a process of recognizing those performances and the quality of those performances. Maybe it sounds crude in the documentary world to talk about performance, but I think it's actually really useful. And we had to recognize, or I had to recognize, like you would with an actor's performance, is it good? Do I feel it? Is it real? And there are times when I had to make very judicious decisions about finding the performance that was emotionally true, maybe sometimes not even necessarily factually true, but emotionally true, and also times when the performance perhaps didn't ring emotionally true, but was still useful for other reasons. And this was I don't remember kind of having to search through my story with a character in the same way on another film. So
I mentioned to you earlier is I'm sure a lot of you have seen The Act of Killing. And if you think about the two main characters in The Act of Killing, one of them is much more ideologically driven and kind of thinks in a much more ideological way about what happens. And for him, that serves as an actual defense mechanism. He can live a more normal life. Whereas the main character, Anwar, who you sort of see retching at the very end of a film, he's not ideological, he's a playboy completely, and for him it's just a source of trauma. And I think that kind of how you deal with the way that the person sees the world, whether it's a defense mechanism or whether it's actually what they've come to believe about the world, and how you navigate that is very interesting. I did a film about Pussy Riot, and there was an interview that I didn't use in the film, but it was with the guy who basically, I'm sure a lot of people know, so they went into a church and did all these things, who initially pressed the charges against them, wrote up all the things, and he was kind of one of the big catalysts for why they were put on trial and all these things. And by the time he was being interviewed, he had regretted doing it, he didn't really care, but he had to play the role of the offended believer, that he had to play that he believed blasphemy to be this huge thing that should be punished. And he very openly said that, you're assigned a role and you kind of have to play it for a certain time. And what you do with that is really tricky as a documentary, because on the one hand, you do want to understand where this person is coming from, how they see the world, that they do have these values, and then at the same time, you feel like, okay, but it's kind of bullshit. And and you want to challenge that. You want to see tension. You want to see the person respond to it. You want to see the person really deal with the consequences of their action and have that. Essentially, I think the most interesting thing, especially in interviews on camera, is when a person really struggles with that, when their ideological foundations are slightly shaken. And with the arms dealer, it was really interesting because you learn so much about, for me, all these concepts that I had about what the arms trade is, what the arms industry, even what weapons are, they kind of just fall apart. And you realize that for people that are on the inside, there aren't these lines. It's just cargo, or it's just they work in this military sphere, which we've privatized, and it exists like this, and it has a degree of normality. And even war has a degree of normality. And what you do with that worldview is really interesting, especially if you're trying to push a person to have some sort of, to reflect on their actions, to have some sort of moral accountability.